Welcome to episode 63 of Anchored in Education. I'm E. Scott England, and Anchored in Education is the podcast dedicated to all things education. Educators across the world routinely engage in conversations surrounding fundamentals, concepts, and new ideas that improve this great profession. Sometimes we agree, other times we disagree. But at the end of the day, we are all anchored in education. I talk a lot about leadership, but I am always careful not to make talks about leadership specific to superintendents or specific to principals. This is because I fully believe that every one of us in education serves as a leader. Probably the first and most important step of this is understanding, recognizing, and valuing the importance of this. I hear all too often teachers say, "Oh, I am not interested in leadership." I get what is being said. You are not interested in the headache of administration. You are absolutely at home in your classroom. And guess what? There is nothing wrong with that. Let me use my wife as an example. When she worked in the lab, she was an all-star. She had the ability to motivate and inspire those around her. She could work and get along with everyone, and she knew the proceedings of all areas of the lab. In short, she would make an amazing director of a lab somewhere. You can imagine her response, though, not interested. And it was when I had this conversation with her that I first realized that some do not aspire to be in the lead, but we can all be a leader. Okay, let's get back to education. Have I mentioned before how much I love ASCD? I know I have. I especially love when I receive my member book, which is how I came across the book Adventures in Teacher Leadership: Pathways, Strategies, and Inspiration for Every Teacher. Now, this book is not a primer for how to become a principal or an administrator. No, it is about how to become a leader right where you are. Commentaries and sections about various teachers of the years are scattered throughout, creating a riveting reading experience. Joe Fatheree, one of the authors, is the 2007 Illinois Teacher of the Year. Not only has he been an award-winning teacher and author, he has also earned accolades in filmmaking as well. He is also a founding member of the education advocacy and policy organization Advance Illinois. Above all, for today, he is our guest on today's Anchored in Education. Joe, welcome to the podcast today.
Well, thanks for having me on. I'm really excited about having a conversation with you.
Well, I am just as excited to talk about this book that I've read that we're going to talk about today. But before we do that, I think we'd like to find out a little bit more about you and how you became anchored in education.
Well, this is my 31st year of teaching. I'm an instructor of innovation and creativity at Effingham High School, and just thoroughly enjoy my job now more than ever. I was blessed to have an array of great teachers growing up. I grew up in Xenia, Illinois, which is a really small town in the northern part of southern Illinois. And I was blessed to have some teachers there that just saw promise in me. And they just were, I actually think, revolutionary educators at the time. We did all types of just different instructional strategies and things that, people might not think they would find in a small town. And I was fortunate enough to have those teachers, and they really encouraged me to go on and do things even when I doubted myself. And I went to Florida High School and was blessed to have another round of great teachers. And all the way through graduate school, I've always had that group that's just inspired me to take the next step forward. I was recognized as the Illinois Teacher of the Year in 2007. I was recipient of the NEA's National Award for Teaching Excellence in 2009. And then 2016, I was named one of the top 10 teachers in the world by the Varkey Foundation as part of the Global Teacher Prize. And actually today I saw online earlier that today, 4 years ago, Stephen Hawking's announced me and the other 9 finalists for the Global Teacher Prize.
Wow.
And that was really, it was really humbling moment in time when you had somebody like that, call you out and recognize you for the work you've done. And I'm also smart enough to know that, I stand on the shoulders of giants. I've had a lot of great teachers that have inspired me, either ones I've had as a teacher or ones that I've worked with, or, ones that I followed, whether it was reading or online. And I try to take bits and pieces from them and apply back to my instructional practice. And now I'm in a position where, as a Varkey Teacher Ambassador, I serve as an international ambassador for education, and I get to work with, millions of teachers around the world and tell their stories. And it just makes me a better person. And unfortunately, I look at, there are teachers who are far better than I am that will never be recognized for whatever the reason is. And part of my role is making sure and sharing their stories and celebrating their success. So that's kind of where, how I got where I'm at today. But like I said, I'm really inspired by the kids that I teach and the opportunities I have to share best practice with people. And 31 years in, I feel like I'm on more fire today than I've probably ever been.
That that is awesome to hear, because a lot of times that's not the story that we hear when you're at year 31. But if we think about it, that is what we want. We want teachers to be on fire throughout their entire career and finish stronger than whenever they started. And it sounds like that you're doing that now.
Well, and I would just say, and like you say, that's not the case for everybody. And we're on the front end of one of the biggest teacher recruitment retention crises in the world. UNESCO says that we have a global teacher shortage of 69 million teachers by 2030. Illinois is one of the fourth worst states in the country in terms of recruitment and retention. And so we really need to find ways to really inspire our young adults to consider teaching as a viable career. When I first started teaching, I would have, and I've surveyed my kids every year since I've started teaching, and it used to be 30 to 40% of my students looked at teaching as a viable career, and now I'm down to hardly any of them that will look at it.
Wow.
And it's one of those things. They see the stress that's related to the job, they see the issues that are surrounding it. And one of the things I think we've done a poor job at, and I'm just going to call it out, is whether it's a classroom teacher or a building principal or superintendent or school board member, we've done I think, a pathetically poor job of celebrating teacher success and helping teachers understand how they can stay connected to the real world while being into the classroom. We have, I think, a 1950s vision of what teaching looks like, and this is we're moving quickly through the 21st century.
Yeah.
And so we've got to look at different methodologies and what teaching really is in the 21st century, and what skills that we need to have, and how we support them as community members and as administrators. So that's part of my role right now, is really crafting that new vision for what teaching looks like.
And I love the advocacy and the policy portion of what you are doing for education. You're right. We don't celebrate enough, and we have kind of this. Well, that's how I went through education. That's how I think education should still be mentality, and that's not right for our students. And when we talk about best practices of 21st century, I mean, you're right. We're 20 years into this. We should be well past what are the best practices, and we should be in and doing them. And I think we're going to get to talk about that in a minute. But I also want to cover. Maybe it's not related to education, but it's kind of unique to you. You are the recipient of 3 Mid America Emmys for filmmaking.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, my grandfather was a storyteller,
Okay.
and I've just been fascinated by it ever since I was a little kid. And I would sit around, on family vacations and listen to my grandfather tell one story after another. And I, along with my cousins, were just captivated by him. And so I guess it's kind of been a part of who I am. And so I had the good fortune of being seated next to Craig Linval, who unfortunately just passed away a few weeks ago with pancreatic cancer. But he was a classroom teacher that figured out how to become a filmmaker. He went on and After he retired, he was a state board member for the Illinois State Board of Education. But he and I worked together for several years. We made documentary films for that aired on PBS nationally, MLB Network, Documentary Channel, over 100 million homes nationwide. And it would be on the weekends. I mean, we would fly down to spring training when we were doing a film on minor league baseball, and we'd interview, professional baseball players. Another weekend we might be in DC interviewing the Secretary of Defense for a film we did on the Vietnam War, or we might be out in the summer in the Grand Tetons filming a disabled mountain climber who crawled up Everest on his knees because he had cerebral palsy. And I had that opportunity to really work with Craig, and it was a true blessing from God to be able to work with him on those projects, because we got to be able to tell a lot, some incredible stories about some amazing people, and talk about the human condition and what we need to do to support people, but also the fire that burns inside them, and what their intrinsic motivation is, and what drives them forward. And so, to me, and well, for Craig and I both, we also had the pleasure of teaching together for several years in our in the innovation class, and we used all of that stuff that we learned from these kids, or from these interviews. We'd bring it back to our classroom every day. And so, our kids became the recipient of meeting all of these people. And we'd bring Congressional Medal of Honor recipients to our school,
Wow.
or, nurses from, there were and MASH units in Vietnam. And just, our kids got to able to meet those people. And then because of that, we also made a lot of connections. And so our students were invited to fly to Paris to speak at UNESCO at the International Summit on Human Rights, or their film footage showed in every country on the earth on the same day as part of a project that was a big Hollywood project for a film called One Day on Earth. And we met the directors, and they asked our students to be involved in these projects. And so, they were life-changing moments for our students. I don't know if in your area, if you have a CEO class
We
that
do.
down there. Well, that actually was born out of my classroom.
Oh, wow.
I had a student come in one day that interviewed a local business leader, and he came back all inspired, and he said, what, I came up with this idea, and I talked to this business leader, and he said, well, here's how you take it and mass produce it and bring it back here and you sell it. And so I called the business leader up on the phone, and I said, you've inspired this kid. And he goes, well, what do you want to do? And I said, well, I want to start an entrepreneurship class. I said, I taught one my first year of teaching 7 years ago in another school district, or several years ago in another school district. And we went out in 2 days, raised $150,000 of startup capital, had 50 business partners sign on, and they wanted a teacher to teach it. And I'm like, I need to help get this board up and running and doing things, and talk about the curricular side and work with the business partners. And they're like, well, who will teach the class? And I said, well, the perfect person sits across the desk for me, and Craig Winval. And Craig went on, and he taught the class for several years, and then started the Midlands Institute for Entrepreneurship, and then it spread, and I think it's in 55 cities across the United States now. And so in my classroom, that's one of the things that we kind of become as an incubator for ideas. It's how hydroponics has started in our school district, and now we have stations, in our high school. We have them in junior high. We have them down in second grade, and that's one of the really great opportunities that's come not only out of the filmmaking work, but out of the Teacher of the Year program and the Global Teacher Prize, is that I am constantly able to bring all of these resources back to my students at Effingham and be able to share them with other teachers and kids. And it really just, keeps that fire burning, I think, in all of us.
And I think that is a great segue into the book we are talking about today, which is Adventures in Teacher Leadership: Pathways, Strategies, and Inspiration for Every Teacher. Now, you co-authored this with another outstanding educator, Rebecca Mieliwocki. Let's open with a conversation on what teacher leadership is, and let's dispel any misconceptions listeners may have, such as teacher leadership being administrator preparation.
Well, it's exactly not that. And I mean, I guess if you wanted to be an administrator, you could. I have my Type 75. I've had opportunity to step into the administrative field, and it's not that it hasn't been of interest to me, but as of now, I really enjoy working with my students on a day-to-day basis and really helping them unlock, the creativity in their mind. And so for teacher leadership, it's very much about developing those leadership skills that you need to be a successful classroom teacher. Now, that can be on a lot of different fronts. It's being able to advocate for your students. It's being able to advocate for the profession. It's being able to collaborate with other teachers in your department or your building, or, like in my case, in different parts of the world. It's being able to, be able to conduct research and be able to figure out if your students are, struggling with different core concepts. How do you be able to find interventions that work for your students to be able to do things? And what I found, and a lot of people look at teacher leadership, well, then it must be a position. And in our district, I co-run our teacher leadership program. We talk about, it's all in a suffix, where there's a difference between teacher leader and teacher leadership.
Okay.
And in a lot of school districts, especially in, I think, more suburban schools, they have instructional coaches that do different things, and that's great. And if you can have those positions and do things with them, that's an incredible opportunity for your teachers to have that person to be able to work with and do things with. But unfortunately, not every district has the funding to be able to do those things. And also, where what we felt in our district was, we would be falling short in providing the leadership side, because even though every teacher may not have a formal position, every teacher would benefit from having the teacher leadership skills to make him or her more successful in things. And so in our district, it's a voluntary program, and we'll get into that a little bit later, but every teacher has the opportunity to go through the leadership training. And in today's world, where a lot of this has also come out of, we in the past, societally, have had a very rigid system in our schools. It's, the state board of education decides, the policy that we're going to follow. It comes down typically to the school board. They look at it, they develop their own policy, then it goes to the superintendent, who's in charge of executing the policy and administrating it, and then that's farmed out to building administrators that do it at the building level, and then it's the teacher, and then it's that very rigid chain of command that we all have to go through from top down. And there's very little time or space for a teacher to have an idea that can be shared directly with the superintendent. And because of that, even a lot of, and I've talked to people at the state level, there are building principals that are fearful of teacher leaders because they think they are taking their jobs. And that's not the case at all. And if we have administrators listening to this podcast, you need to understand, this is not trying to replace administrators. It's trying to empower teachers with the tools they need to be successful, and also help you with all of the work that you have. I talk about, in many of the speeches I give, about the impossible role of the building administrator today. By law, they're supposed to be in the classroom 51% of the time,
Yeah.
or focused on instructional practice 50%, 51% of the time. We know that there's no way that's going to happen with all of the discipline, just the logistical pieces that you're supposed to do as an administrator. There's no, and with the new evaluation models that we have, even if they're in the classroom, it's not really in there as an instructional leader. And there are issues that are coming up. There are more challenges coming up in society, and we may get into this a little bit later on about future ready skills. And it's only going to grow exponentially. And so we have a choice at looking this right now and saying, okay, the model we had worked for years. It's not working at the level that we want now. And so if we can provide our teachers with the ability to collaborate with one another on how to be able to develop programming and to be able to solve curricular needs or discipline needs at their level, and share that information with a building administrator so that he or she sees that it's, in line with the culture that everybody's wanting to be able to create and do things, that's a benefit. If we're teaching
Absolutely.
and if we're teaching our teachers how to collaborate outside of the classroom and talk with parents and community members and make it more transparent so that we build trust there, that's a good thing. And I can go on and on about all of the good things of it. Is it different? Does it Does it feel strange in the beginning? Probably so. But, it's like any new thing. If we work together and we open those lines of communication up, we as a team, we understand what our goal is and we can work through those things. And I would also challenge your listeners to pick up a book. It's called Creativity Inc. by Ed Catmull, who is the founder of Pixar. And I really get a lot of my inspiration through the work they do. They're a platinum level company, one of the top in the world at what they do, maybe the best in the world at what they do. And what Ed Catmull learned very quickly was when he started that organization, I always should hire people who are smarter than I am, and I should never look at them as a threat. I should make sure that everybody is talking to everybody. And he has these mantra that he works by, and he's like, you know what? At the end of the day, everybody knows who signs the check, and they know who's ultimately in charge of making the final decision in the district. But that doesn't mean that I should feel threatened by other people talking. And it doesn't mean that other people shouldn't be encouraged to come up with ideas that they can share with me and other leaders that might make our jobs better. And so that's actually what our book is about. Now, in the past, when I first started, you weren't called a teacher leader, you were called a boat rocker.
Okay.
And matter of fact, you were encouraged as a pre-service teacher, don't let anybody know your name at the administrative level until you get tenure.
Right.
And as I've grown older, I'm like, that was the worst information somebody could have ever given me.
Horrible
And I do
advice.
think, yeah, and I do think there's a difference between. I tell people there's a difference between a boat rocker and a teacher leader. To me, a boat rocker has they've got a negative idea in mind, and they've got an agenda they're going to go push. A teacher leader is trying to push and trying to work and trying to grow and trying to make things better. And a leader doesn't always mean you're in front. You could be behind, you could be beside. There are a lot of different supporting elements there. So I think the change in terminology has been really important. But for years, there was not really any format around that. So Catherine Bassett, the former CEO of the National Network of State Teachers of the Year, she used to work for ETS, Education Testing Service in Princeton, New Jersey. And she had the opportunity to bring, I think it was in 2009, a lot of educational stakeholders together. And they said, you know what, up until this point in time, teacher leaders were born out of necessity. That's how I kind of became one. I was teaching a class of struggling readers, and the way the system had worked in the past did not work for those kids. And so I either had to learn to become an advocate for them, or this was in my second year of teaching, or I was going to find another career, because what we were doing was not working, and those kids did not have really an advocate pushing for their rights. And so that became me. And this was prior to the internet, when I didn't really have a way to go out on social media and find somebody that was doing the kind of work I was doing. You just kind of went out and tried to find people. And so I went out and started looking for mentors, and it was humiliating. I'm just going to be honest. I felt like as a college graduate, I was told you should know all of this. And I found out really quickly there's a difference between the art of teaching and the science of teaching. And I had to go find people who were master artists, and not necessarily in teaching, but maybe in business, or maybe in, they were in clergy, or they were a farmer, or they whatever, but they were masters at their craft. And I wanted to find out how they learned how to work with people and how to inspire people to do great things. Well, what Catherine and her group did was actually formalize teacher leadership, and they put together teacher leader model standards. And that when we talk teacher leaderships, we can talk apples to apples instead of apples to oranges. And so from that, time passes, and Catherine and I are both, she's the CEO of the National Network of State Teachers of the Year. I work a lot outside of the classroom, so I was their director of strategic projects. And that was another great thing that happened was, I worked basically two full-time jobs, one at Unit 40 and one for Instoy. And I could take all of those resources that I would need every day, whether it was, talking to Charlotte Danielson or key researches at AIR, or, the list goes on. I was able to bring that back to my job every day, and it made me a better teacher. But we came up with the idea of we needed some type of book to be able to share what teacher leadership is. Rebecca came on, and we were able to work as co-author and meet some incredible teacher leaders across the country and help tell their stories, through those different chapters.
Absolutely. So this book is it helps lay a path to teacher leadership, like you've talked about, with 5 key chapters revolving around communication, collaboration, professional development, data, and advocacy. So let's start with communication, or building bridges, as you say. So eh, we kind of even mentioned this earlier. How are we 20 years into the 21st century and still falling into patterns of being silos or islands? And more importantly, what can we do to make sure we're communicating to everyone around us?
Well, I would challenge most of your listeners to go back in their school and do a deep reflection and say how much and look at how much really meaningful communication actually takes place in their building and in their district and out to the community members. I think the community members are the last to find things out. Districts have done a better job in the last few years. One of my roles right now is, I guess, quasi communication director for our district. And, we've tried to put a lot of information out on our website. We're doing more storytelling through Facebook and other channels. But, our parents send their kids to school every day. And unless kids come home and tell them what's going on, they don't really have a clear
Right?
understanding. And, we get frustrated policymakers like, well, why are they making these laws up? And like, well, they don't really have a clear path into the classroom to understand how policy is impacting classroom. And then likewise, there are a lot of schools across the country that even in departments, doors are closed and teachers really don't share best practice. And I don't think it's necessarily out of want, and I'm not here to blame anybody. So I want to make sure that's clearly
Sure.
stated. But the past practice has always been, when you walk, a matter of fact, Terry Caldesall, one of the guys we interviewed for the book, is a 2007 Wisconsin Teacher of the Year. He talks about in his interview that for years, when you're a teacher, you close your door and you're the monarch in the room,
Yeah.
and it's your rules. And that's not necessarily the best way for kids and the best way for teachers, but it's what it is. And teachers have learned to survive that way. And, in our district, we do a lot of our teacher leadership centers around personality training. And what we've found out, what we've discovered, and is a thesis for another book, is that if you use disc training, you have dominant, and you have the inspirational, and you have the S personalities that don't want conflict, or you will have the C personalities that like very much things in order and sequence. And a lot of our 60, I think it's 67, 69% of the population are S personalities that don't like conflict. They're not going to step up and have that first conversation. And so it's not necessarily a teacher thing, it's a human thing. And that we just think teachers have the ability to talk to adults like they do students. And what we're finding out is they don't.
Right.
And what we need to do as administrative leaders or as teacher leaders, we need to, and I always tell teachers when they start this, your teacher leadership journey starts where you're at today, and that's okay. And you need to grow as you grow, not as Joe grows or not as anyone else grows, but as you grow. And, we constantly talk to our teachers about failing forward. It's okay that you fail, but as long as you're trying and you're doing well, and past practice, that's not how school is. And in school, we have the grading scale, and we know what F stands for. And unfortunately, we branded failure as a horrible thing instead of part of the learning, growing experience and being embraced and working through it. And so that's what we really try to look at as in growing teacher leaders and communication, is how do we get people talking? How do we get people sharing? What lines of communication have been closed in the past? How do you go have a courageous conversation with a veteran teacher that you may not agree with? How do we encourage young teachers to come in and really seek assistance from veteran teachers? And so there are a lot of different strategies in there able to look at and to be able to apply to you as you need. But I think first most important part is realizing we need strong communication channels, and those do not always happen. If you go to department meetings and they just are non-functional, where people just talk all the time about things that don't matter, or you have somebody that bullies the conversation, how do you set norms so that you can actually work together to be able to do things? And that kind of shifts over to the collaboration piece, where communication is getting people talking, that's the practice, and or how do you share information. The collaboration piece is more about how do you get them to partner to work on projects that you need to move forward to do things. And both of those are essential parts of teacher leadership. As a matter of fact, collaboration is the foundational standard in the teacher leader model standards, that if you can't get it down, then your chance for success in the other areas is limited, because you don't really have any sharing of ideas. You're not building synergy in your building. You're not creating a positive culture in your building. And I would even close with this uh, fact is, I think culture happens out of sheer happenstance in most buildings. You think about how many buildings actually sit down and craft out a culture collectively that they want, and they really build the infrastructure to make that happen. Most of the time you walk into a school and it's just what it is, and you inherit what the past administrative leaders or teachers had, and there's really very little conversation about what do we want it to be and where do we want it to grow to. And in most cases, teachers and definitely students or parents are never involved in that process. And I think that's a shame. And I think it's something that's actually quite fixable. And in the 21st century, we've got to look more to moving towards.
So you mentioned collaboration, which is where I was going next because it is chapter 2 and it does pair nicely with communication, but it has some distinct differences. Here's a key part I picked up from this chapter, and it's the feeling that educators often get, which is the need to always know everything. And so this often includes leading us to avoid what you talked about, avoid taking those risks and avoid failing and not failing forward. So how can we leverage the communication to our advantage to increase our network and improve our practice?
Well, I think one thing is that from a leadership perspective, and whatever that is, whether it's superintendent, building principal, teacher leader, that you talk about failure as a part of the process. And I really think it's also about setting collective goals as a team. What do we want the culture of our building to look like and to feel like and to sound like? So we do this in Unit 40, and we ask them actually to come up and we divide our teachers up in groups. And one of the things I think is one of the most interesting exercises is we have them on chart paper, as groups list this stuff out. But we also talk to them about, illustrate. And one of the images that will always stick with me truly the rest of my life, was when we talk about those silos that you mentioned earlier. An art teacher had drawn a picture of a teacher standing alone on a desert island. And that's what they feel like.
Oh,
That's what school feels like. And so when you wonder why teachers are leaving the profession, or you wonder why people are not considering it as a profession, or if you wonder why your teachers are burnt out, many of them feel that way, like they're on a desert island by themselves, where they have no communication tool to share any of their issues. And if they feel like if they share them, they're going to be judged, there's going to be retaliation across the board, or that they are not meeting people's standards. So it's easier just to keep it boxed in all the time. And what you see is, and I'm telling you because I do see this, you see um, teacher attrition rise. You see them not being as, their fire starts to be squelched, or you see they get sick because they bottle all this up and they don't know where to let it go. And that's where we've got to come in, and we've got to talk about it's okay. It is literally okay for us as a team to have failure. It is literally okay for us as a
absolutely.
team to push ideas forward that might not work. Now, when we push ideas forward, one of the things we might think about, and we'll get this a little bit later on, have we researched the path? Have we drawn out like a business plan the best that we can to say, okay, here's where we want to go? What support mechanisms do we need to have in place to be able to do those things? But when we come together as a collaborative to do those things, and they're non-judgmental things, and we share it with the greater community, so no matter what district you're in, you're saying, you know what, here's a direction we're wanting to go. We're going together and this is a team. Then people are aware of it and they understand the purpose of why you're trying to go there. You're always going to have a few naysayers that come along the way, and that's just part of it. But if you're working together as a team and community members are now part of your team, then it makes it more palatable and easier for people to go that direction. In most school districts, those pieces are not in place. And so thinking about, how do we have conversation around this at staff meetings? How do we every year or every 5 years, come together and brainstorm what direction do we want to go as a department or as, a building, and not just we do it on our discipline plans because by law we're mandated to have those conversations. But how often, and I would ask your listeners again, so right now, one of the biggest challenges we have globally is the advancement of new technology that's coming out, especially artificial intelligence. So I said on a committee in London, we have a report due to British Parliament this year in December.
Okay.
It'll go out, I believe, to UNESCO probably next year, talking about what future, we're building a model code of ethics for artificial intelligence in education. But part of my work outside of that is what future ready skills do our kids need to have to be prepared for the future? And without getting off on a tangent, there are reports out there that says within the next 10 years, 74 million jobs are at risk in the United States. 74 million.
Wow.
Wells Fargo came out and said within the last couple of months that 200,000 banking jobs in the U.S. are at risk by 2030. So that's less than 10 years now.
Yeah.
So what district do you know of that's having those conversations about futuristic skills? And what district do you know that's invited community members in to say, you know what, we need to be looking at this as a community family to do those things? I think if you take those challenges on as a family, you get there. I've helped start a nonprofit in Alabama called the National Coalition for Safe Schools. And our job is focused on stopping school shootings.
Okay.
And we're looking at SEL and mental health. And how does all that come together? Well, again, how often have communities had conversations about those things? So I think the first piece is setting down and saying, okay, what's our goal? And secondly, what communication channels do we already have in place? And how are we communicating out? Who have we empowered to have those conversations? Do our teachers feel like they have the ability to do so? What type of training needs to take place? And it might not be on big issue topics like that. It might be, how are we going to roll out guided reading in our district?
Sure.
How are we going to look at our students are struggling to achieve in math at the level that we want? And so, but again, it starts out with that goal in mind and then figuring out, do our people have the tools they need or the skills they need to have those conversations?
Joe, this has been fun so far today, but it is going to bring us to a close to this part 1 of Adventures in Teacher Leadership, and we're looking forward to hearing the rest of the story next week.
Yeah, thanks for giving us the time to share, and I look forward to hearing all of these amazing teacher leadership stories that come up from schools all across the country. Share those with me at Joseph Fatheree on Twitter. Love to hear what's going on and how we can support your work.
It is quite easy to see how Joe is an award-winning teacher, and you can read more about Joe on my website, escottengland.com. I'll also link to his book in the resource section. And like he mentioned, you can find him on Twitter. Search at Joseph Fatheree. So don't forget to subscribe to Anchored in Education on whatever platform you get your podcast. You want to make sure to subscribe so you can catch part 2 of the conversation on Adventures and Teacher Leadership with Joe Fatheree, right here on Anchored in Education.